One of the heroic acts she did just before she retired from civil active duty to, I believe, retirement was her raid at Combahee Ferry in South Carolina. We know that the Union Army made good use of her services because although those people were also Black soldiers and volunteer South Carolina Infantry, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, their leadership was given to Harriet Tubman. Montgomery himself was an abolitionist, as we understand later on. So he had no problems with Harriet Tubman leading the way to show where to step, what not to do, which area is swampy, because she had made research before the day of the attack. She had gone back to Confederate areas while they were asleep, and she had found out that there's lots of rice, corn, tobacco that they can carry with them.
So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nilgun Okar, to speak to you about higher power calling, Harriet Tubman and the Pennsylvania Underground Railroad. Take it over, Nilgun. Thank you.
And I am very thankful to be invited to speak to you, GAR Museum, with the invitation I received from my dear colleague and friend, Andy Woski. Yes, we established with him 21 years ago the first academic study and a conference on Underground Railroad. Every year we picked different themes and topics. We had a wide variety of topics to choose from, but Harriet Tubman came up many times, so did John Brown and Frederick Douglass. So we take pride in being able to sustain this conference with the help and support of my college and my department, which is Africology. So Andy, of course, has always been incredibly resourceful, finding us good speakers, distinguished speakers with good books and good perceptions. This year, we invited Alvin Pettit, the finalist sculptor, who will be establishing the Harriet Tubman Monument in front of the City Hall to the Broad Street side, northern facade, in 2025. We are hoping that in addition to Cato, whom we honor and remember once a year, we will also have Harriet Tubman now to lay wreaths at her feet. I will be talking about her and Alvin's sculpture in a minute. When we start talking about Underground Railroad, we have to understand that, especially in Pennsylvania, there was a very diabolical community who looked at enslavement not necessarily with sympathetic eyes like you and I do, but rather with suspicion. And out of this suspicion and doubt came out many leaders who were really founders of the state, who themselves had very confused state of minds, especially in the beginning of their lives. One of them is William Penn, the other one is Benjamin Franklin. I will speak about them very briefly because you know their life story. But this slide you are looking at is, I think, a significant document to understand the evils of slavery. This is, of course, Harriet Tubman's ad. She was called Minty by her mother, and she escaped. After her escape with her brothers, this ad looking for her was sent to a couple of newspapers by her owner, Eliza Ann Broaddus, after the death of her husband. She needed money, she was in debt, so she decided to sell Harriet and other young and energetic enslaved people on her property. But of course, these news were already being expected by Harriet, and being an intelligent woman, she decided to escape just before the sale, and she took her brothers with her. So this is about them. On Monday the 17th, 3 Black people, Harry, Ben, and Minty, $100 reward will be given for each of the above named. You have seen it many times, so I don't need to read it for you. So this is how we start. Despite William Penn being a Quaker and coming to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, trying to establish a brotherly state and a brotherly city, he had confusing ideas in the very beginning. He owned slaves, especially at Pennsbury Manor, where he built a country house. There were 7 Africans who worked for him. But towards the end of his life, especially after he returned to England, he decided to manumit these 7 people, and some of them had already been quite old. I find this very ironic that in one of the inner walls, William Penn's prayer for Philadelphia is, of course, engraved on a metal plate. And he says, "My soul prays to God for thee, that you may stand in the day of trial, that your children may be blessed of the Lord, and thy people saved by his power." It is ironic in the sense that as a person who has inherited lots of land because of his father's wealth, really, or the king owed to his father lots of money and he couldn't pay, then he decided to give the land. As you know, this is the old story. So having inherited land without having worked at all, he has the audacity as a young William Penn to own 7 people and make them work for him, because he commuted to Philadelphia on the river, and he had a 6-oar boat, which were, of course, driven by these Africans. The young William Penn looked quite handsome and royal, but of course we also have another person, Benjamin Franklin. Especially in this portrait, I like the look in his eyes. He looks like a wise old man, but he was also a very funny man that many people spoke about him, about his jokes on his friends. He himself was also a slaveholder. And when he was in printing business, he was advertising the sale of Black people, Africans. But he also changed his mind. This is why I said all these people were diabolical. And he decided to free these Africans who worked for him and became the president of Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. So he also advertised in his newspaper that he's collecting money, donations, in order to give to these needy people. The year is 1787. We are still not aware of the Underground Railroad because it didn't start until 1830s, but we see a change of heart in both men. So how did the Underground Railroad begin? There are many stories, but I'm going to cite, as you have heard this before, because some of the people in this audience are really seasoned Civil War readers and audiences. So you are a very educated audience. If I'm making any mistakes, I apologize, but please also send me messages if you have new information coming out from your research. People really talk about a few events that triggered the beginning. In 1786, we know that Quakers in Philadelphia assisted a group of fugitives from Virginia to freedom. This is mentioned in Blockson, in Siebert, and other resources. And they all talk about this man, Isaac T. Hopper, who was in those years, 1787, a teenager, having organized a small network to hide and aid the people who are escaping. I decided not to use the term fugitives. I also decided not to use the term slavery long time ago. I'm using instead passengers or freedom fighters. For the enslaved people, whom I mean the Africans who were taken captive and brought to this land, I'm also refusing to use the term slave. I use alternatively Africans, Blacks, or if this is with reference to Underground Railroad, I use the term passengers. The second incident that we find mentioned by several resources is General Thomas Boats, who lived in Columbia, Pennsylvania in 1804, has refused to surrender a person that he owned or a neighbor's African servant, and he protests the authorities. And this incident becomes the first anti-slavery act in Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, it's also rumored that he got on his horse and he chased this kidnapper for a long time and was able to get the person, the African, back from the kidnapper. The last incident, which is also very frequently mentioned, it took place in Ripley, Ohio. There was a man who came looking for his servant by the banks of the Ohio River. He couldn't find it. He said he was walking maybe a few meters ahead of me and I saw him, but then he disappeared. There must be an underground road here. He goes back to the town and asks their help. The townspeople in Ripley, Ohio were apparently abolitionists, and they laughed at this guy. And this anecdote was repeated many times. And the word that he used while searching for the African man became the title of this journey. Now we are talking about. The story of the Underground Road was repeated in that part of the country for many years. And I believe it got transferred to Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania has its own reasons to use railroad terminology, and I'm going to explain it in a minute. About this Isaac Hopper, I have read so many beautiful things, and one of them is in William Still's iconic and epic research volume, which we look at several times when we are writing about Underground Railroad. According to him, and he has written 6 pages about Isaac T. Hopper, born in 1771 at Deptford Township, New Jersey, died in 1852, still mentions him as the friend of not only the imprisoned people, but also of the enslaved. Imprisoned because Isaac T. Hopper spent some time after working as a tailor. He got involved in the prisons and he became inspector of prisons. Later, he moved to New York, again worked for the Prison Association. William Still described him as a man in plain brown or black coat with broad-brimmed hat and his antique shoe buckles, commuting every day by train to Philadelphia. If you remember this picture that I shared with you, it's right here. This is the perfect description. And this image is also in William Still's book, and I have seen it at many other resources. To make a long story short, Lydia Child, the famous author, was also a close friend to Isaac T. Hopper, and she referred to him as Fountain of Benevolence. So apparently, as a Quaker, he was really sacrificing a lot, just like some other Quaker leaders did when they were helping the Africans. There are 2 incidents that are called and categorized as the armed resistance to enslavement, and one of them is Christiana resistance, which took place in Chester County in 1851. After the Fugitive Slave Act, every portion of the country, even the free states, became very dangerous for anyone escaping or being assisted to escape. Edward Gorsuch, who came from Maryland to Christiana in the middle of cornfield, this house, where he heard his servant was hiding. This house belonged to William Parker, and at that specific time, there were 4 more people hiding with him. With the help of the townspeople, this armed resistance, of course, benefited those people, Parker and his friends, who were escaping. They avoided the kidnapper, but Gorsuch and his son were both killed. They got wounded and then they suffered injuries. The 4 men escaped to Canada. With the help of Frederick Douglass, believe it or not, they made their way to Rochester, and at Rochester, we know Douglass was the one who helped them get on a ferry himself, personally, walking or helping them get on a carriage in order to take the sea route to Canada. I find this very interesting because look at this. This is a small world. Of course, William Parker may have heard that Frederick Douglass is in Rochester, and he's the one who's going to help him. So here is our wonderful Douglass helping 4 other people, just like some people helped him when he was escaping from enslavement from the eastern shore of Maryland. I'm not sure if I need to repeat this part to you because, as I said, you have invited me a couple of times, and you are an educated reader and a group of audience yourselves. But we understand that nowadays there is enormous interest in Underground Railroad history, much deeper than it was in 25 years ago, when Andy, my colleague and friend, and I were both speaking about Underground Railroad, being both Commonwealth speakers. I'm sure he will confirm this, this thing with me. Nowadays, people are trying to understand Harriet Tubman, Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and others from an academic perspective. It is no longer a myth. When the first time, a few times, I was lecturing on Harriet Tubman in 1994 and 96, a couple of people asked me if I'm really talking about the truth or these facts. They were thinking Underground Railroad is a myth. So I had a hard time explaining. And in those days, I was a young assistant professor at Temple. It was very difficult for me to explain to them and make them believe. Now I speak with more confidence because not only there's more interest, but there's more respect, and there are more research data coming out. And thank God, with the help of this Underground Railroad, we co-founded with Dr. Woski, we are able to look at all the research material from the primary resources, primary books, and it is now an academic subject. I'm very happy that we did contribute this much to American academia and research from the perspective of the Black history. As you heard in the beginning from my colleague and co-founder, Dr. Woski, we invited this year on 21st of February as part of our annual conference, as a matter of fact, the 21st year, a famous or almost going to be famous person, Alvin Pettit. He is this gentleman in the slide. He is the finalist out of a group of 5 people who was chosen and commissioned to do this statue and this monument, which will be really quite tall, I think, not as tiny as you would imagine and seen in this sketch. This is just one of the drafts. We asked Alvin for almost 1 hour many questions, and he was so kind and so down to earth. He explained to us several things. I will concentrate on 2 of these questions. I think someone asked, why and what did he envision when he tried to create these hands? Harriet Tubman's hands are clasped. Is it because of anger? Is she praying? Or is she now reflecting upon what's going to happen? Then someone else asked about her military garb. And as you see here in this one, I'm sorry, I have to take you back. She's carrying, and I'm sure Andy can explain later, a rifle, a musket. She's in military gear. There's one more detail that I should share with you. One person asked, what is on the ground? What is she stepping on? Is it a stone? Is it a rock? And Alvin explained that he envisioned a Confederate flag under her feet. Of course, it's symbolic. I doubt if it ever happened, but we have to respect the artist's vision, because by this flag, Harriet Tubman might have been saying, you know, this is victory. In the end, we won, we defeated. So our victorious consciousness comes out alive. That part was very touching for all of us. Now let's talk about our Harriet Tubman. Born under the name Araminta Ross in 1822, the daughter of Benjamin and Harriet Green Ross. She was born, according to the records, at her father's house, which was located on the farm of Anthony Thompson at Peter's Neck at the end of Harrisville Road, which is now part of the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Her mother, owned by Brodes family, nicknamed her Minty, as you have seen in the ad, which I added here one more time, Eliza Ann Brodes. When this ad came out in the Delaware Gazette, Harriet had already escaped. So it must have been the end of September and the beginning of October. But where did she live? I looked at the place she lived because she often referred to waters. Water is a very important factor, and it is really a metaphor, not only in Harriet Tubman's life, but also in Frederick Douglass's writings. He often mentions water, ocean, sea. He's very much attuned to the nature. The clouds are important for him, the rain, the storms, as you will remember in his famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. He's talking about dark clouds and a storm gathering, mentioning the Civil War. But this one for Harriet is important because she grew up along the banks of the Choptank River, 73 miles long, the largest on Maryland's eastern shore. Her first hometown in Bucktown was very close to the river. She felt the ties and memories of her childhood here first. I believe this is why Tubman was adamant about understanding the waterways. And we know she also walked with her passengers in the creeks many times. But that was also another reason for her to avoid the people who were trying to catch her, because as long as you are in the water, the dogs cannot get your scent and you can easily escape or avoid. I should take back the word easily. I'm sure it was nothing like easy that we would imagine. So Choptank River and this area, if you look at this arrow, at the tip of the arrow is the area, according to my own research, where she lived. Of course, the house, the Brodes house is no longer there, but here is a historic marker. I also looked at it from another perspective and put this arrow here. It must be right near, very close to Choptank River's right banks. And in this one too, you will also understand it is really, according to the place you stand, it must have been on the right-hand side. But this area is extremely complicated to navigate because of all these waterways and the river moving inside. This is all Choptank coming from the bay, Chesapeake Bay, going all the way up and then running to Delaware. So for Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman to be able to navigate this complicated landscape in order to escape, and we know Harriet Tubman walked, but Douglass took a train and posed as a sailor. It must have been extremely difficult. Of course, we do not hear much except Douglass wrote in his autobiography and narrative, and he tried to perfect it 3 times. Having said this, I want to mention a new initiative by the National Park Service is to create Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway. They followed the Choptank River and they indicated 45 historically significant locations. It is a self-guided driving tour. I really appreciate this effort. Not that we benefit directly from it, but they are highlighting Harriet Tubman's and Frederick Douglass's life and area where they lived. And I think it's important due to the location theory that we study at Temple in Africology department. It shapes your life. Wherever you are from, where you are born, shapes your future life. So I believe there is a lot of maintenance here, trying to keep up with this landscape and trying to find these 45 places. But if you are ready to spend a full day, you will be able to do this Underground Railroad Byway. And anything that popularizes Harriet Tubman's legacy is welcome, in my opinion. It's a great effort. as I mentioned before, they wanted to define the Eastern Shore landscape by creating this. And also, the second point that I want to make very briefly is, as an educator, I'm understanding that younger generation really does not seem to care much as we do about the past. So maybe it will help young people traveling with their families or their teachers on this interpretive byway to understand what happened before and after the Civil War. I think it's a very good teaching point. It will create new consciousness, and consciousness awareness is our goal nowadays, really, isn't it? I will talk about John Brown briefly. But Harriet Tubman, of course, was called by him General Tubman, and her own people called her, meaning her relatives, friends, those people who heard her fame afterwards, referred to her as Moses of her people. I added one statement that I really found very deep. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. Excuse me. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. I was in heaven. Imagine this young person, 27 years old, maybe 25, running, and when she reaches freedom, she looks at herself and can't even believe. She says, I looked at my hand to see if I'm the same person. This is part of the, of course, Harriet Tubman Odyssey, which we all know very well. Harriet's owner, Edward Brodess's finances got worse. And this was the time when her mistress decided to sell her. When Brodess died in March, Harriet waited to get the decision visualized first in her mind. As you know, she did not know how to read and write. She was illiterate, but this doesn't mean she didn't know anything. She was, first of all, she was a very intelligent woman, a young woman, and she was resistant and resilient too. So she said, let me wait. Is this rumor correct? Because they are talking about selling me and my brothers and other young people. So this family can pay their debts. And it was correct. So she waited until the summer is gone, probably because it would be easier for her to escape in fall when there's lots of work in the fields. And she decides to take Henry and Ben with her. She would travel at night on clear skies, as we know, and North Star guided her. But it was really her inner spirit and her instincts which made her travel the safest route. We also know that when she was younger, she was hit, and this created some kind of injury in her brain, and she would have fainting spells occasionally, not very often. In one of these fainting spells, she has a dream, which is coming up about John Brown and how she met John Brown. And there's also a research being done about, did she have any role in planning this raid on the federal arsenal with John Brown? And some sources say yes, the others deny it. But I have to mention both to you. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. This map is always very helpful. I added these narrows to show you that it was not just Harriet who escaped, but many people escaped, especially north, but not necessarily through Underground Railroad. However, the main route followed the Mason-Dixon line, came to Pennsylvania, particularly Philadelphia, then turned towards left and crossed the lakes area. One went directly up by following the land route. The other major route followed a sea route with the help of captains and sailors. who would allow them to hide in these boats. Not that these were modern boats, but they found ways to secretly carry people. And as I said, not many people chose that route. Frederick Douglass had, papers given to him, and he posed as a sailor with free papers, and he was lucky he got out. The other two routes, I believe, started from the middle part of the country, including Tennessee, Kentucky. But I have to make a point once I finish this. One little group we know went towards Texas and maybe towards Mexico. The other smaller group went all the way to the south towards Florida. The other day, I was giving a lecture at East Stroudsburg, and one lady asked a question, and it was such a good question, really. She said, well, if this person started from Georgia, would she be able to come all the way to Philadelphia with the help of Underground Railroad? And I immediately understood that I had not explained how it works. If someone was in Georgia or Alabama, those people would not try a northern route. They would do the easiest and the quickest and the nearest route. So it is either south, southwest, or southeast. I believe a person would not go all the way to Georgia, although it is not uncommon. We heard that there was also some instances, and this comes to us from William Still's book, because he kept the records of everyone. So I believe Still's records, as well as Siebert's records, were quite reliable. Why do I request everybody who is studying Underground Railroad to look at Harriet Tubman as a major strategist? Well, because of her skills in navigation, because of her ability to create strategies to escape and to hide whenever it was necessary, and because of her intelligence to use subversion. These are all military tactics, really. So this tells us Harriet Tubman was not just a girl who grew up on a farm and just tried to escape. She was a very intelligent woman. She knew the routes by memory. As I said, she used strategies to avoid danger and capture. She used coded language only her passengers would understand. And I believe she educated them before she started the trips. Her favorite spirituals were not sung because she wanted to sing. It was really to send a message. Wade in the water, of course, when there's a dangerous situation. Go down Moses when she wanted to pray and maybe give thanks, especially when she reached Canada and knelt at St. Catherine's Chapel to give her prayers and thanks, and follow the drinking gourd, which is another popular African song with many African elements, but also Americanized. Follow the North Star. So there are many examples like this, but these are not just her leisurely activities. She had a purpose and she followed the plan step by step. Another question came recently and said, well, if she didn't know how to read and write, how would she know all the routes? I think people do not understand, or they underestimate the impact of memory. So I would say by memory, and she had a good memory and she knew the landscape. If you know the terrain and you know it well, you will understand what is dangerous, what is not dangerous. And she did that. She did not lose anybody on her group. And we know that she made either 17 or 19 trips. The number has been shrinking since 1994 or 96 because we started talking about 300 people reached her freedom because of her help. Now, many other scholars are saying, no, the number cannot be more than 70 or 100. And I am I'm in between. If she made 17 trips and if she brought at least 8 people each time, you make the math and calculate. The system of operation, as you know, was a very secretive organization, but it was loosely knit, meaning people really did not reveal any information to strangers, but it was operated because of those acquaintances. Conductors were known as pilots or agents. Railroad terminology became very popular, which I will explain in a minute. If you opened your house, you were a station master. If you did not want to be involved but volunteered and donated money, then you were a stockholder. All this railroad terminology became very popular starting 1830s. So for someone who's asking, when did this operation really start? Although we do not know exact date, I think it became more operational and more popular by 1830s. Although the fugitive slave law stopped many activities right before the Civil War. I checked when the first railroad charter in North America was given, and it was in 1815. Surveying, mapping, and construction started on the Baltimore, Ohio line in 1830, and they were able to open 14 miles of track before the end of that year. Then we see the first regular carrier of passengers and freight trains between Baltimore and Ohio, completed in 1827, and on the Christmas Day of 1830, South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company completed the first mechanical passenger train. This is lots of history, but I think it will give you some perspective and background. So if we take 1830s, let's look at Pennsylvania. Very interestingly, Pennsylvania becomes the pioneer in railroad development. 1840s and 50s, they spent time putting down more tracks, and by 1860, Pennsylvania has surpassed all other states in total railroad mileage. And this was a position Pennsylvania held until the 20th century. I think it's a very honorable situation for those of us who are living in Pennsylvania to know this history. So maybe it was more in Pennsylvania than in other states that these terms were adopted earlier than the others, and for a good reason. But as Charles Blockson said, and I think I skipped that part, Mr. Blockson used to say, it is neither above the ground nor under the ground. People have to understand this, and you have to make sure. This is to me. And I was mentored by him for a very short time period, and he was telling me, you cannot say that there was an underground tunnel unless you are 100% sure. And of course, I listened to him and obeyed, and it was a good decision because there's always stories, myths intermingled with the part of this history. And we should be talking about realities rather than myths. Here in this slide, I am trying to show how many people mentioned in William Still's book entered Pennsylvania. It was really through the Mason-Dixon line coming from the south. This area became very popular because it was easy to enter Pennsylvania. However, they did not stay in Philadelphia too long, as we understand. They moved, especially towards north. I mentioned Auburn right here because it will be the second place Harriet Tubman chose to live after the Civil War, and made her home. And her destination most of the time was to reach St. Catherine's. Crossing this bridge, there was a tiny bridge here. I think now there's a bigger bridge. Right there on the other side, you will see St. Catherine's Chapel. I'm sure many of you traveled that direction, so you know where it is. Was Philadelphia a safe haven? We cannot say that it was a refuge because there were always dangerous people living or coming to Philadelphia to catch these escapees. But In Philadelphia, there was a very interesting situation. There were many free blacks since the beginning. And when you explain this to your students, they do not want to understand, or they cannot believe how could a person be free and African at the same time. Well, they were either manumitted very early, or they had arrived as or born as free blacks, and the city had many wealthy Africans and African Americans who chose to live here because of their business. Portan, Purvis are some of these families. The other factor which made Philadelphia more attractive was its Quaker and Methodist population, and the rise of the anti-slavery sentiment in their meetings were very, what should I say? It gave rise to confrontational discussions because not all Quakers wanted to end slavery because they were also receiving some help from these Africans. They did not have many African servants who were working for them, but even if they had, they would try to keep them. On the other hand, there were people like Lucretia Mott and Mott family and other Quakers, distinguished people who wanted to end slavery because they considered it a sin. So we look at New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore as those cities in 1800s who had at least 10,000 people, maybe more or less, but they were all free Africans. So we have to also understand that Philadelphia's location attracted these people because it was also a safe harbor, meaning many navigational routes passed from Philadelphia. One of the points that I should mention is Yoko, the lantern holder. This is a popular story, but we know by fact it is correct. George Washington, when he wanted to cross the Delaware, left his horses on the shore on a very stormy night, and he left the 14-year-old African, Yoko Graves, who was his servant. When he returned after a couple of hours towards the morning, he found his horses were doing well, but Yoko had frozen to death. He was still holding this lantern and the candle was still on. He blames himself and he is really deeply hurt because of his own mistake. He orders a statue, and the statue is built and placed on his estate at Mount Vernon. So after that day, Yoko, very interestingly, becomes the symbol of freedom and maybe passion and human fragility. After that time, we see Yoko statues in different sizes being placed as ornaments, but maybe not necessarily as ornaments as well. This is one of the most popular questions asked when I speak. Well, what about the quilts? Can you combine Yoko as a symbol of freedom or safe passage, especially when the lantern is lit? And can you combine this with the quilts showing maps and put outside in front of the door? I would say yes for Yoko. I'm sure it was used in combination with an American flag and a lantern when the passage is safe, but I would say no to the quilts. One reason is people traveled at night. So who would have time to come and study the quilt in front of someone's door and thinking this house is a safe house? How could they be sure? Kidnappers and bounty hunters were everywhere. And if they were able to catch one person, they would be rewarded $1,000 per person. So it was a very lucrative business. Maybe they saw quilts that were thrown outside the house so that it would dry, but I have no understanding how one can create a map to show the passengers the route. So that should be eliminated. If you go to Sullivan Hall today at Temple's main campus, Mr. Blockson, who donated all his books and his papers, to this library, you will see a wonderful replica of Yoko. And I think this is the best I have seen so far. Yoko stands in front of the door. So please plan a visit to Temple University main campus, Sullivan Hall. Hosanna AUMP Church was a very popular place for Harriet Tubman. She met there a couple of times with Frederick Douglass, and this church was also used as a resting place, and maybe a couple of hours, not necessarily days, because it's a very tiny little church. But the Hinsonville population, this building is the last remnant of left from Hinsonville, which was an entirely African village or town until almost not many things are left from its history. But it is very close to Lincoln University. So if you travel to the west on Baltimore Pike, you will probably come up and see this African Union Methodist Protestant church. Worship was being done here, but at the same time, at night, there were passengers who were crossing, because we know this because Tubman stopped here. And of course, nothing is written about these places, not to endanger the owners or the people. Our wonderful friend, William Still, Harriet Tubman's best friend in Philadelphia, his historical marker is at 244 South 12th Street. We call him the father of the passengers because he started writing everything when he met these people and he boarded at his house for a couple of nights. He would take all the details from them, interview them. Where are you coming from? What is your mother's name? Where are you heading to? The person would probably say, I have a niece in Boston. I'm trying to reach Boston to find her. So these two locations would be entering William Still's book, which he kept as his records for many years until he published them in 1872 and became the most comprehensive volume on Underground Railroad and the heroes. But it also served to unite families, because at the end of the Civil War, people were all scattered all around. They were trying to find their relatives, their children, their parents. And William Still, if they could reach William Still and ask him, would be able to help them. He was also a free African because he was given, or he received his freedom early. He was from New Jersey, but lived in Philadelphia as a coal business and stove business he had built himself. So we have to remember his contribution to our work. We cannot skip Thomas Garrett, one of the most dedicated Quaker abolitionists. Got into trouble many times, but also a good friend of Harriet Tubman. He got in trouble because he was helping people who were escaping. He did this when he was young. There are many records of his struggles with the court system. At one time, when he was fined almost $6,000, he agrees to pay the amount, and then he stands up and he says to the judge, you have left me without $1. I say to you and to all people in this courtroom that if anyone knows a person who wants shelter and protection, send him to Thomas Garrett and he will befriend him. After he was fined this huge payment, he did go to Wilmington, but he still continued his efforts there. He died in January of 1871, and I found out that he was very much favored by Black residents of the city. Many people came to his funeral and he carried the casket. They had so much dedication and respect for his work And of course, today, Garrett Road is very prominent in Upper Darby, and his house, one of his houses, is still up there and being protected, I believe, as a historical location. I'm not sure if I need to mention the details of fugitive slave law and Dred Scott Supreme Court decisions. I teach this in my race and racism courses to tell my students how far back we can go to understand the injustice. What happened to Dred Scott? He was in a free territory, but the judge said, even if you are in a free territory and you have lived there, this doesn't mean you can be called a free man, so I'm going to take you back to bondage. So Dred Scott and fugitive slave law, which really made every location in the United States very dangerous after 1850, are some of the negative milestones in the evolution and development of freedom actions and protests in the United States. Let's talk about John Brown before we finish. John Brown met Harriet Tubman a couple of times, and one of these places is recorded as his house in Chambersburg, and also this last location, the Kennedy Farm. We also think Harriet Tubman was involved, giving him navigational information, what to do, what not to do. But during the day of his attack to the Harper's Ferry Federal Arsenal, Tubman got sick. So we know that she was not involved physically, but her brain effort was provided. This may or may not be correct. Maybe Tubman being this intelligent woman so that it will not be successful. Because Douglas warned John Brown and say, this will not fly. You better stop this plan. It's crazy. John Brown, being the person who he was, didn't listen. But the raid he had on the federal arsenal, of course, ended tragically. He was wounded when his two sons, among these 21 men, were shot and died. He himself was carried to the courthouse for a very short trial. He was in prison also for only maybe a short time, and he was hanged in December of 1859. John Brown's legacy is important for Underground Railroad because this is the number 2 after Christiana resistance, an armed resistance to give freedom to those people in the area. Christiana was successful not for Edward Gorsuch, but for William Parker and his friends. But this one, John Brown, was not successful at all, although it was a message sent, I believe, to those people who were running the government in those days. Harriet Tubman, and after her activities ended in Underground Railroad, became a spy and a scout for the Union Army. One of the heroic acts she did just before she retired from civil active duty to, I believe, retirement was her raid at Combahee Ferry in South Carolina. We know that the Union Army, and now I'm very thankful that Andy Waski, Dr. Waski, is listening, and all of you who are Civil War buffs will probably confirm this. The Union Army made good use of her services because although those people were also Black soldiers, a volunteer South Carolina Infantry, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, their leadership was given to Harriet Tubman, although Colonel James Montgomery was the one who was commanding that unit. But Montgomery himself was an abolitionist, as we understand later on. So he had no problems with Harriet Tubman leading the way to show where to step, what not to do, which area is swampy, because she had made research before the day of the attack. She had gone back to Confederate areas while they were asleep and she had found out that there's lots of rice, corn, tobacco that they can carry with them and give to Union. And this is exactly what happened. Of course, you can read more often than this single slide. But that day, the Union Army rescued 800 people, and they were walking to their freedom with the help of Tubman. I'm sure you have watched Harriet, the movie, which depicts that scene very vividly. It's really very touching. So we see our Harriet Tubman as a scout and a leader of the Union Army unit, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry. Tubman's good friend and Frederick Douglass, of course, he had escaped from the same location. I included him, and this much, only 2 slides on Douglass, because of their relationship to each other. They supported each other, and they respected and loved each other all their lives. And I believe the reason is they both shared the same landscape when they were young and even children. Of course, Frederick Douglass becomes this famous orator and speaker because of his skills, who learned reading, writing himself, but did not stop there. He learned Latin and French. This is a touching sentence from him. I didn't know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted. He wrote his autobiography 3 times and changed it each time, added more. Excuse me, but published first time in 1845, making him the first person narrator, the only one, and the first talking about the evils of slavery from a first person narrative viewpoint. And of course, it became an immediate bestseller. It was reprinted 9 times, translated into French and Dutch, and circulated not only in the United States, but only in Europe. The Library of Congress has named narrative one of the 88 books that shaped America. I think that's a record, especially coming from this man, this humble young man who memorized every lecture, every speech he read in this humongous volume called the Columbian Orator, which was summarizing all the lectures that were given by distinguished speakers from Greeks, Romans in history, all the way to Europeans and Americans. Douglass memorized each one of these. And this is a copy of the 1799 edition. What hurt me when I went to see this Frederick Douglass historical marker was this name, 1817-1895. Frederick was not just a patriot. And why would you use the N word before him? You could have said an African American patriot instead of this term, which I protest. But you cannot change many things. However, this marker tells you in Talbot County, where he was born. Moving further, Frederick Douglass also became a famous supporter of women's rights. At Seneca Falls, 1848, he was among a handful of male attendees. So we see him for the rest of his life supporting women's rights, especially women's rights for ownership, property ownership, women's rights to education and divorce. This is important to him as much as the voting rights for Black people. So we see him as an advocate of this. Philadelphia had rich and wealthy people, but Philadelphia had also religious leaders and founders. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones founded the Mother Bethel because they were not treated nicely when they attended a ceremony, a religious ceremony in one of the white churches. So Mother Bethel is really an outcome of a protest movement. And of course, it still stands beautifully, although the origins go back to 1787 at the location of 6th and Lombard Streets. During the Underground Railroad, we know they helped those people who came to them. During the yellow fever epidemic, they were also helping the white residents of Philadelphia who were afflicted with this yellow fever. But Richard Allen wrote in his memoirs, "We helped the city as much as we could, but we could not get what we expected." Respect. That was a very interesting statement by him. Robert Purvis, James Fortan, they established Free African Society. They became the first Black millionaires of Philadelphia, donating lots of money to Underground Railroad station masters and conductors. William Still, for instance, gave money to Harriet Tubman to travel to the South, and it was because of the Free African Society and also Philadelphia's Anti-Slavery Society. Because Still was the secretary of these two distinguished groups. So we understand all the operations cost money. A trip down to the South, of course, Tubman needed many things, especially shoes and clothing, because she traveled at night, and then maybe fake papers. So they were paying people to let some of these passengers have a free passage from Philadelphia and onwards. She lived in Auburn and she died in Auburn 1913. Her last act was to donate her house to those people who are elderly so they could be taken care of at their old ages. We know this woman sacrificed so much, but yet look, she died in Auburn. This is her final house. And then she was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. There's so much to talk about Auburn, especially her friendship with Senator Seward, but I do not have much time to give you that much detail. However, this is important. This is one of her photographs, which was not seen before. It is a recently found rare photo, and I think I received this from the email that came from your organization. It may even have been sent to me by Dr. Woski. So I really found this very interesting. She's around age 70 and dressed very nicely with lace on her dress. We are approaching to the end. How do we teach Harriet Tubman to our college students? We have to understand that we have to approach her from an African perspective, which is also Afrocentric perspective, meaning putting her into her natural location. Before being an American, she is an African. So people also should mention her cognitive skills, her intelligence, her use of memory for navigation, her risk-taking, and her bravery. She was able to carry dual roles. She was an Underground Railroad agent, then she became a scout, a spy, and even a nurse. Posterity assessment. We have to look at her messages, her message of hope for those in bondage. It must have been extremely overwhelming for her to be able to escape and then give more hope to those in bondage so they could also have courage to walk with her. But most importantly, her message of freedom to those people in bondage, her message of freedom to Africans is incredibly important. Humanity. We must talk about Harriet Tubman's humanity. In the African diaspora, humanity is extremely important. We talk about ma'at, harmony, balance, spiritual guidance. So we have to give all these honors to Harriet Tubman when we are evaluating her. Her African ethic. She was the person who fit this African ethic 100% because she was saying, not maybe verbalizing, but she was standing for unity, one for all. I am not existing if you do not exist in freedom, this kind of attitude. But I found this also philosophical because in African philosophy, we believe in Sankofa, which is a bird. the bird's feet are facing forward, but he's looking backwards. And there's also something in its mouth. Sankofa stands for return and retrieve. Go back and learn from the past, or go back and get what is yours. So Sankofa and Harriet Tubman match perfectly. Last point, in African epic memory, there is polyrhythm. Her leadership is a good example of polyrhythm, meaning you can respond to several things at the same time, or you are a multitasker. Centeredness, she is extremely centered because of her determination and resilience. She knows who she is. Circular, another African philosophical asset. Higher sense of responsibility. You are elevated. And when you elevate yourself and your expectations from life, then you can help others. Epic memory. You know who you are. You know your ancestors. You have to do what is expected from you. You cannot give up. You cannot change. This is the summary of victorious consciousness. How could I not talk about Camp William Penn and all those soldiers who were trained here? This was the center of our conversations with Dr. Woski many times, and we also had twice the theme of our conference as Camp William Penn, talking about Lucretia Mott. But I wanted to enter them to honor USCT, who always come to us, and we always go to them, especially at Kato ceremonies. They always represent USCT. So I owe them a great debt, because even this last conference, 21st, two people came to us, Al and Robert, and we are so thankful to have you among us. Thank you, Dr. Woske, for bringing your friends into our circle at Temple. So with this one, this last slide, a beautiful picture, of course, not a real picture, but depiction of the star walking at night and being quiet, is Harriet Tubman. I will end this session, and I know I went, and past 1 hour, which is great. I couldn't give up any of those slides. This is Angela Davis. Angela Davis is an African American author, a brilliant woman who used to teach in California, and who was jailed many times for her ideas because she's considered a leftist. But I love this, and I adopted this statement as part of my signature. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. Angela Davis. So Harriet Tubman became the epitome of change. She brought change because she could not accept captivity. I salute her. I salute Angela Davis, USCT, Garrett, Frederick Douglass, Isaac T. Hopper, and everyone else, William Still, that I mentioned. I salute all these heroes for creating such a humanitarian effort, and really not for their own sake, because they didn't earn any money. They did this for humanity. I thank you very much for inviting me. I have, now that I have passed and I'm already late, I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions, and I thank you very much for listening to me and inviting me for your speech on this special occasion. Thank you. If you have questions.
Well, it was certainly a pleasure having you. If somebody has a question, you can please unmute yourself and speak up if someone has some, because we have it just for a short period of time now. Oh, we have one. Brian Fields, he's got his hand up. Brian?
Yes, thanks. Great presentation. Very interesting. And just wondering, is her house open for tours in Auburn, New York?
Yes, yes. It was open when I went there. Yes.
Great. And I know that Frederick Douglass's home in Anacostia area of Washington is a fantastic tour. If you've never had a chance to go, I would highly recommend it.
Yes, I've been there. It's very close to the Capitol. Beautiful. But it's a much later house, really. It's not one of the earliest. But of course, the one in Rochester, I think, burned and his letters, that the letters he received from William Lloyd Garrison are all gone. Whereas we have some, but I had great difficulty when I was investigating that the letter exchange between them, Garrison and Douglas. I couldn't find many of the letters, but guess what? I found a poem Douglas wrote for a lady. And it's very rare to hear that he wrote a poem. It's a beautiful poem with his own handwriting, and he had a beautiful cursive. He wrote a poem for a lady. We don't know who, but there are many rumors, of course, about Frederick Douglass being a ladies' man, which I understand, but I also do not pay much attention, because what he did all his life and how many people's lives were saved because of his example, I think is more important for me as a researcher.
Ace Carol, would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, I am a research historian and curator for the African American Civil War. I gave a presentation at the 13th Gullah Festival called An Abolitionist Raid on the Cumberland River. And the reverend at that, where I gave that at the church with the African Baptist Church in Beaufort, South Carolina, he later became a congressperson in South Carolina. And one of the first things he did was to put in the name of the bridge that over the Cumberland River after Harriet Tubman. And so there is a bridge. I mean, there's a marker and there's a bridge that's named after Harriet Tubman that crosses the Cumberland River on Route 17 when you go into Beaufort as a consequence of her work there. Another interesting thing I found out when I was doing research there was that the song, I think Sparky Rucker is a folklorist who did a version of a swing low called Swing Low Sweet Harriet. And they used to substitute chariot when the master was there. That was supposed to be a code for Swing Low Sweet Harriet, come down to the low country for to carry us home. So that was a kind of interesting aside I learned from the culture of the Gullah people. And
That's so interesting. I would love to have a copy of that. If you can email it to me. I would love to include that. And this is my email, anadolu@temple.edu. As you know, my name is Nilgun, and this is my email. So we would like to talk more about Harriet Tubman this year and next year, because Alvin Pettit said the statue, or let's call the monument, which will be 2 feet tall, will not be unveiled until fall of 2025. So we have time.
Okay.
I think we should popularize Harriet Tubman and Underground Railroad during these 2 years, so more people come to Philadelphia to see this wonderful statue and then walk past to the other side and visit Cato.
I just had one more thing, is that doing my research, the thing that convinced the legislators that she did, in fact, was operating that area, I found a receipt that was given to her paying her $100 Secret Service money, made out to Harriet Tubman. I actually found a receipt for that.
Really?
And that was part, and I presented that at one of my presentations, and I'll send you a copy of that. It's in the National Archives.
All right. I'm sorry, I missed your name.
Asa Gordon. Research historian and curator for the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C.
Oh, my goodness.
High Street. Oh, wow.
Thank you so much.
Nilgun.
Yes.
The statue of Harriet Tubman will be 14 feet high. I'm sorry, you made a slight mistake. You said 2 feet
I
high.
did.
That was the demonstration model.
Yes.
So it will be very large and very noticeable.
Yes. I meant to say 14. What did I say?
2.
No,
it's just a few feet. Who cares?
What we saw, I mean, he didn't bring it to Temple, but he showed us pictures. That's why I made the mistake. Yes, this will be a taller one, probably taller than Cato Monument.
Yes,
But
it will be.
But aren't we lucky to be in Philadelphia? So this means, Dr. Woski, we have the tradition of laying the wreath to Cato, and now we will be laying wreath for Harriet Tubman.
Absolutely.
This
Guaranteed.
year, it will be costly for us, but hey, we are ready to it. And you know, Temple's heart is always with your projects, Dr. Woski, and the GAR Museum. We appreciate what you are doing.
Nilgun, thank you so much. I know you have to go, so thank you, and thank you for everybody who participated. And we'll be getting together in person in our next permutation. That is April, I think it's the 3rd. We'll be in person at the GA. Well, it's not at the GAR; it's next door to it, because we're not big enough, large enough to house a program anymore. We moved 2 years ago, as you know, and it's have no conference site. So we go to the Methodist Church next door, but the museum will be open, and the talk will be held by Kyle Purchase, who's a member of our board, and we're looking forward to that. So that would be at 1 o'clock on April the 3rd, Sunday, April the 3rd, at the Holmesburg Methodist Church. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. All right.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you. If you have questions, anybody in the audience, I'm sorry I couldn't respond to everybody. I apologize, but please send me your questions through email, and I will also be very happy if Dr. Woski, I need a copy of this presentation. Please send me a copy. And yes, you can post it on YouTube. The more, the better. Everybody should know about these events going on to honor these people whom many people try to forget and make us forget, but we will not. All right.
Thank you.
Have a beautiful day. Take care. Thank you. Bye. All right. Wonderful. I see Dr. Gordon and I see Bernice, and perfect. Many people attended. This was great. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much for listening.
By the way, a record turnout for the weather out here. I think 85% of people are speaking.
Oh, wonderful.
Yep.
This group should attend our conferences. Please consider in February, we will try to use GAR email list to advertise. This year, not many people attended, and I was quite disappointed because we invited a famous sculptor. So please, next time, support our conferences at Temple, please. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Nice.
God bless. Thank you.
What a pleasure.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.